I've always had this idea that there are some questions that are extremely important for an individual to answer in their life. The most important question being, does God exist? That question determines so much about the way that we live our lives, what is important, what has value. And the second question that I'd ask is, once one has decided that God exists, it is, who is God? These questions are questions that have been asked for a very long time. One of the most famous individuals who has asked that question is a man by the name Aristotle, a very famous philosopher, and he has this idea of the unmoved mover. Today we're going to look a little bit about this idea of the unmoved mover and the idea that God is the unmoved mover, and how we can understand how he defines himself through this. We're going to start off in Genesis chapter 1, at the very beginning, and it's very obvious. At the very beginning, God defines himself as the creator. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis goes on to talk about the creation account and describe all the ways in which God created what we see around us and how that came to existence. But I think it's important to understand and realize that at the very beginning, God defines himself as the creator. We often wonder, or perhaps we run into situations where we are talking to a loved one or a friend who maybe does not have a relationship with God, maybe does not understand who God is, and they might want to know who is the God that you follow, why do you go to church, why is important in your life to study and to try to do God's will. And one of the things that I think is important, sometimes we overcomplicate that answer. Today I want to look at some of the instances where we can answer this question, and at least one of the ways we can answer this question in a very simplistic way is to say that we follow the Creator. We follow the God who has created everything. God defines himself in those ways. We see this as an example in the story of Jonah, which is one of my favorite stories. And Jonah, as Jonah has been told to go and to preach to Nineveh, and he's decided he does not want to do so, he's run off and he is on a ship and he's heading away, and the ship runs into a storm. And as they are fighting in the storm in Jonah chapter 1, beginning in verse 7, we read about the response that the people on the ship had. And it says that, and they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." And so they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. And they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" In verse 9, and he said to them, "I am a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who had made the sea and the dry land." And then the men were exceedingly afraid, and they said to him, "What is it that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. We see in this instance, when the people are asking Jonah who he follows, who is this God, we need to understand it in the context in which they exist. These men on this boat probably had come into contact with people who believed in all sorts of different types of gods. They believed in a God who did this, a God who did that. And Jonah, when he is choosing to describe who God is, he describes him as the one who has created, or the one who has made the sea and the dry land. See, Jonah used God's creation as a way to explain who he followed. And so we can look at this, and we too can use this and understand that God is the creator God. We see this continue in the New Testament. At the beginning of John's Gospel, starting in verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, "And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and darkness has not overcome it." We see here that John, when he is describing who Jesus is, he uses a few different key phrases that I think are important for us to understand. First, he describes him as the Word. All right, he said that he is the Word, and that the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he goes on to talk about the idea that all things, verse 3, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. When our friends and loved ones ask us, who do we worship? Who is God? One of the ways in which we should respond is God is the one who has created all things. There's a lot of philosophical argumentation and discussion about what it means, about whether or not the earth had a starting point. And it's pretty simple to look out and to say, as we look around, that what we see had a beginning. And if that had a beginning, whatever was the thing that created it, whatever was the thing that got it started, whatever that is God. So we follow the God of the Bible, the God who is the Creator God. In Romans, we receive a warning about some things that have happened, because this is something that people get confused on throughout history. In Romans chapter 1, I'm going to be reading verses 19 through 25. It says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." See, one of the things that has happened throughout history is people have elevated the creation above God. They have elevated nature. They have elevated the trees and the beautiful rivers and the beautiful lakes and all of the creatures that we see in them. Whether it be the dolphins jumping in the ocean, whales, whatever beautiful creature that we might see and we might look at and say, well, that is an amazing thing. They have elevated that and worshiped that. Romans warns us that that is a mistake. That what we're supposed to do is worship the creator of those things, not the things that have been created. This seems pretty logical and pretty self-explanatory, but again, something that we see happen all the time. In a world in which people choose to examine what is going on around them, we must examine the things that we see and determine whether or not we believe that those things have been created by God. We look at the trees, we look at nature, and we look at all the animals that we have around, and we look at all the different characteristics. We understand through the study of science and through the way that we examine history, that history and science seem to suggest that what we see in front of us had a beginning. That at one point there was nothing and then there was something. We have to recognize that if this is true, then whatever it is that is the one who created that something from that nothing, that is God. The Bible tells us that the God of the Bible is the one who's created all things. We are called to worship God. We are called to follow him. He is the unmoved mover.